Hi students, this is an exemplar concept map from our recent assignment. So this is the concept map for the metastatic brain cancer, and this particular map is from a student who scored highly within this section. So how did we mark the concept map section? Well, there were actually three criterion that we looked at. We looked at the risk factors, which was criterion 1. We looked at the general pathophysiology, which was criterion 2. And then we looked at each of the 5 clinical manifestations, which was the criterion 3. And you were scored accordingly from those 3 criterion. So starting with the risk factors, what we were looking for here is how the student demonstrated a process that these risk factors were likely to increase the risk of the diagnosis occurring. So there were 3 risk factors: the female sex, the HER2 positive phenotype or subtype, and the young age being less than 40 years of age. So that particular patient was under 40. So to get full marks within this criterion, basically the female sex was a risk of into the breast cancer itself, so that's the etiology, whereas these two were more associated with, so in the literature, these two risk factors were more associated with the risk of the breast cancer spread into the brain. So I'll explain this quickly now. So the female sex, that's a much higher risk than the male sex, and the reason for that is most likely due to the hormonal difference. And these hormones, estrogen, progesterone, they promote breast growth, so it's actually the cellular growth within the breast. And as these are going through cycles within the period of the female's reproductive years, this is increasing the likelihood of mutations occurring, which therefore goes into the likelihood of breast cancer. Okay, so that's how that one should be linked. In terms of the younger age, many students put this actually into the breast cancer, which was incorrect. Actually, to develop breast cancer, it's more associated with an older age, so kind of in the 50s, not in the 30s. So the risk for a younger age in this particular case is the risk of the breast cancer spread into the brain. And same with this particular subtype. So the HER2 subtype is more associated with, it's got a high risk of, once the breast cancer develops, spread into the brain. So these two needed to be linked somewhere in the process of spreading from the breast to the brain. Most notably, its invasive qualities. So its likelihood of metastasizing, particularly crossing over into the blood-brain barrier, that's probably where they're most accurately linked. In terms of the criterion 2, so this is pathophysiology. So to get full marks here, or to score very highly, you need to demonstrate firstly the kind of carcinogenesis, so how the breast cancer came about, but also, and more importantly, how the breast cancer spread to the brain. And so this needed to be demonstrated through how it moves out of the breast tissue, gets into some kind of circulatory system or lymph, and then that moves into a systemic circulation, and then you needed to demonstrate how it actually gets into the brain, crossing the blood-brain barrier. Now, many students lost marks here because they spent way too much time and too many boxes in the carcinogenesis, and they were very brief in the pathophysiology of going from the breast to the brain. And it was this kind of limited resolution or limited detail where they lost marks. Another area where students lost marks was just the logical sequence. They were just out of place and they didn't make sense in how they actually would have presented that way. And again, this student demonstrated very well how they did this. Finally, we looked at criterion 3, which was a process for each of the 5 clinical manifestations. Students again lost marks because they generalized and they had a lot of these 5 boxes coming off 1 point, particularly the clinical manifestations which were associated with the brain tumor, such as the headache, seizures, and dizziness. Many students would have this linked straight off the box of intracranial pressure increase, so they needed a bit more depth to get those full marks. Another thing where students lost marks was in the lump. Many students had this lump come in before the breast cancer, which would actually not be possible. The breast cancer is essentially the first cell that has now mutated to the point that it is uncontrolled and immortal. And it's from this point, this one cell that now is growing and growing and growing, which should be linked into the lump. Okay, so that's again where students lost quite a number of marks. In terms of the other four, the anorexia or the loss of appetite was more associated with the tumours throughout the body that is producing particular chemicals, such as cytokines, which then have an effect on the appetite centre of the brain, which causes the loss of wanting to eat. The dizziness, stronger, its most common or most plausible explanation is associated with, because this is essentially vertigo, dizziness. It's not lightheadedness. Dizziness is you are uneasy on your feet because of balance. So you needed to think about what part of the brain controls balance, and that's the cerebellum, the vestibular system, the brainstem. So it's the effect of the tumor in that area, such as a focal effect, which has the impact on the dizziness. In terms of seizures, the most accurate, and this is the kind of the first main presentation or the most serious presentation of a brain tumor, seizure, and that's an uncontrolled neuronal firing, which is probably most plausibly due to a change in environment in the brain, such as neurotransmitters or pH, things like that, which will have an effect on the way that the neurons fire, which becomes uncontrolled, and then you get the seizure. And then we go to the headache. The headache, remember, brain tissue itself does not feel pain. So you need to think about what structures would report pain. These would be the meninges or blood vessels, and this is because of stretching. And so they're stretched by an increased intracranial pressure, and that's how the headache most accurately would come about. So there you have it. This is again an example of a student that scored highly. It wasn't 100%, but they scored highly, and I thought this was a good demonstration of how this particular student put those three areas together well, and as you can see, scored highly from that.